Well, thanks everybody for being here. We are now at the penultimate session of the Be Better Club for the spring 22 term. And we'd scheduled to talk about the bystander effect today. I shared a podcast with you that I thought was really, really intriguing. Elizabeth Gordon-Smith did a podcast on the bystander effect where she was talking about stories, people's stories about bystander situations. And so I thought we'd talk about that. I was interested in this topic. Some of our participants suggested it, and I was interested specifically because of the intersections between ethics and psychology. Like, what's the overlap between the way that we view ourselves as neurologic animals or psychological animals and the way that we view ourselves as say, rational decision makers or ethical decision makers? And I think the bystander effect is one of these really interesting points of contention. Just to recap the story from the podcast, we get introduced to this person, Thomas, it's not his real name, of course, who worked at a supermarket. And the supermarket as a young person in his early 20s, late teens, early 20s. And the supermarket, like many do, had a code word for shoplifters, but rather than phoning the police or whatever might happen, instead, he said they would assemble the army. So a group of 7 or 8 young men would get together, and basically they were violently or militantly anti-shoplifter. And so they would chase shoplifters down the street and out of their store and whatever. And he sort of recaps the story about his supervisor or his manager at the time, who functionally beats a disabled man for shoplifting. And Thomas, the character of the podcast, does nothing, just stands by. He said he was about 1.5 meters away. And it's really interesting because when I think about the bystander effect, I think about all of the things I learned, like as an undergraduate thinking about ethics. The famous story of Kitty Genovese. Do you remember the Kitty Genovese story in whenever that was, the 60s? So Genovese in New York City was a 28-year-old woman who was murdered, basically beaten and murdered in the sort of center of an apartment complex, apartment building. And there were on the order of 40 or so witnesses to the event. So sort of who heard her yelling, reported to police later, heard her yelling, heard her calling for help, and had done nothing. They neither called the police nor intervened in any way, nor yelled. I mean, they just did nothing. And this became a psychological phenomenon defined as the bystander effect, and started to, psychologists tried to understand why in those conditions, nobody does anything. And it's not just Genovese, but there's lots of stories like this that end up in the news. There was a famous story about a young man, a middle-aged man in New York City who was pushed onto the subway tracks. And there are lots of like photos and phone videos of this event. And he was on the tracks for 22 seconds before he was hit and killed by the train, all the while calling for help, reaching out his hands, and nobody did anything except take videos and photos with their phone. So this is a phenomenon that seems to happen like regularly. Yeah, and yeah. Oh, and thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so there, and Stephen's pointed out here one of the simplypsychology.org links about the bystander effect, really good summaries about that phenomenon. And it's a key thing that's taught to our psychology undergraduates, and it's like a phenomenon everybody knows about. But I want to talk about the tension between the psychology and the ethics. Because I worry a little bit, like if we internalize the idea that, well, it's just a function of human nature or psychological development or something, that when we're in crowds, we don't need to act because it's just part of our psychology. We don't act, like we stand by, right? That worries me. That seems to like, it takes away our agency in some sense. Like assuming that the bystander effect is a psychological effect assumes that it can't be countered or it's not easily countered and that we can't do anything. There's lots of questions here and I don't want to keep rambling on, but like I'm interested in whether we actually do change psychologically or morally over time, as Thomas in the podcast suggested he did, whether that change is progressive, whether bystanders are morally responsible or not. There's all kinds of questions. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot depends, of course, on your upbringing. Uh, One of the things you did mention is whether your religious convictions are involved in some way. Another would be, what kind of training do you have? Now, I spent 20 years in the Navy. We had all kinds of training for fire. Well, I was in a submarine service, so of course we had to save our lives on the submarine, and we were all fully trained, and we knew just what to do. Every person had a particular, you know, thing that they were supposed to do. Um, Obviously, it seems to me that, I suppose, the least involvement would be to call for help, to get somebody professional. They used to train us, call 911. You know, if you can't do anything else, you can do that. Call 911, get a professional involved in it. And so, you know, I think a lot depends on your training. And if you're in a profession that has had some kind of training, then you're going to resort to that. If you're just someone that is just in the business environment and you're in the middle of a situation, you might be kind of careful. You might want to ask yourself, you know, are there weapons involved? Do you think there are drugs or alcohol involved? Those are very hazardous, even for the professionals, like a policeman, to get involved. There's a lot of policemen, you know, that lose their lives getting involved in domestic, you know, quarrels. But here again, you can call for help from someone that you think, you know, even if there's nobody that is ready to act and professionally qualified, you can take a leadership role and say, get somebody to call 911, you know, if you're in a situation close enough where maybe that could take place. Psychologically, yeah, I guess a lot depends on your upbringing, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember in the podcast, Thomas had said he'd been abused as a young child, but that didn't have anything to do with the choices he made in the moment. But he changed. Part of the podcast story was that after this event, after recognizing that he just stood by, he was an active participant, like he'd shifted and he saw himself as an agent of responsibility or something. And so he intervened several times moving forward. And part of it maybe is just habituation, right? Once we habituate ourselves, and maybe that does come from our upbringing or our training, especially our training, I would wager. Yeah. Right. Camille, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with some of it being part of your upbringing. I think, like he said, that he wasn't even able to see it as something wrong, and like being able to acknowledge it within yourself made him be able to see it, like putting yourself in someone else's shoes or acknowledging something as being someone having power or someone taking away power, and then being able to see it in others. I think it's interesting because I think we all like to think that we would be that person that saves, that hero that comes in and intervenes, and other things come into play. I think of being like a minority and seeing how sometimes intervening, someone may confuse you as part of the issue. And so sometimes there are populations that may not want to intervene because they're like, well, hold on a second. They may think that I had something to do with it, and they leave it to someone else. Or they said that there's people that are like, well, I know with my husband, for example, there's been situations where I've seen something and I'm like, oh my gosh, should I call 911 something? And he's like, someone else will do it. Like, don't get involved. That's like unnecessary. You know, and it's funny because in my eyes, I'm like, if this was me, like I'd want someone to call and I want to be the person. And then for him, he's like, you're getting involved where you don't need to be getting involved. So I do wonder if also like you're like being a female versus a male, and some of that, like your role in caregiving could come into play. I think with men, sometimes it's more like the hero aspect. And for women, it's like, I need to take care. I want to make sure they're okay. And I had listened to a podcast a while ago about this guy who was in a class, and his teacher had a rule that you can't touch this fish. Do not touch this fish. You know, he had a pet fish in the classroom, and if anyone touches the fish in any way, they'll get expelled. And so one day, after all the students became in love with this pet fish and loved the pet fish, he took the fish out of the bowl. and sat it on the table. And everyone's like, what are you doing? But then only 2 women came up, picked up the fish and put it back in the bowl. And he had them expelled because he's like, that was the rule. And so when they left the room, he said, but make sure you hold your head up high because you did the correct, like, ethical and moral thing. Everyone else here has to sit back and think about the fact that they didn't. And so it makes me think of like how possibly like some of those decisions, other things come into play on us making that decision, like concerns of what would happen to us if we did get involved, and other aspects like this is your boss, doing this, and I'm in a, subordinate role.
Yeah, Jennifer, go ahead. Your office must deal with this a lot, I assume.
This is why I love the topic. When I saw it on the email, I was like, I have to be a part of this. That is for sure, to get as much information and thoughts that I can. And just for you to, others, great people that I'm meeting today, I work in student conduct and academic integrity. And my job is to oversee all incidences of academic misconduct that occurs. And so I do a lot of workshops to students across campus. And this bystander effect that I talk about all the time. And I think it is interesting when you also played in with morality. When I asked them, you're in a group me, you see that there is a live exam happening, and somebody says, hey, I need answers to 6, 7, and 8 so I can pass this exam and I can keep my bright futures and my scholarships. Who's going to help me out? And people have the sense, and I understand, to want to help, but that helping is actually contributing to something that is not right. The other thing is when students will see it blatant and they know this is wrong. Do they go to the professor and say, I was in a group me, this is what was asked, I don't think this is right, I think you should know. And so I always ask them, do we have a sense of an obligation to say something? I try to get them to the obligation piece, and then the follow through is a different conversation. But can you at least wrap your head around the fact of what you are seeing, is fundamentally wrong? And I also do a workshop, and I ask about, to clarify the statement about there is a cost for doing the right thing. And I go, I think that is a statement that is riddled with problems. But I said, how could somebody possibly lose something if they're doing the right thing? How does that play out? So a lot of the students are, the problem that I get is, of course, you can imagine, as being the bystander part of it, the students are like, well, I'm going to be called a snitch. I'm going to be called, I'm the tattletale of the group. I'm the one that has ruined the student's career by saying to a professor they were cheating. All of the whistleblowing, thank you. There's the word, yes. And so how do we make it to where whistleblowing, I wish there was still a different word than that, I don't know. How do we get that to be more of a thing of, this is what you're supposed to do, this is a good thing, and have it be recognized as such, as opposed to, oh, well, you told on them and how dare you do that and all of this. So interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that because when I took one of Dr. Beaver's courses, I did my final thing on whistleblowing. And one of the things that I found really interesting was I think, like, to your point, I think balancing that positive, the like benefit risk kind of like your moral, like, what are you doing? Is this morally correct? And how much does that weigh into your decision, even though there will be side effects? I think hoping that there's no side effects, and should there be side effects, is different than there actually being. Because I think with a lot of the whistleblowing, even though it's clearly stated and we read it in like when we have to do the UCF like handbook or training through web courses, I still think that there's still a negative. There's still, and we see it with companies where someone's let go after a little bit of time, or so it's like, I think implementing the ethics and morals having a higher ground and saying like, this is what we expect, and no matter what, we have your back in this scenario, and having that be the most important would lessen people feeling fearful about being more moral, doing the right thing. But I think when there are ramifications for doing the right thing, then we're always going to see people possibly do this bystander or not get involved because you're weighing the options. I mean, it's different than like someone's holding a gun versus like, I don't know if I want to tell someone because they may think I'm involved in cheating or they may think other things.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's about trying to make that atmosphere feel safe. And so that people have an understanding of whoever the authority is involved in this. If I witness something that I know is wrong, do I go to this person? And when I do, what's going to happen next? And I think if people really understood the environment and what was going to happen, and then more importantly than that, they got to see it happen. You know, not necessarily that what they're bringing, that the person is guilty and they should be fired immediately and you watch them walk out of the office. But if we know fundamentally that accountability needs to be there, but we are unable to see the accountability in action, that would reduce, I think, potentially some of the bystander interventions. Because, you know, all right, so I said something, but then nothing happens.
There's a lot to unpack in what we've been talking about there. It's interesting, Camille, you gave an example of choosing not to get involved after weighing the consequences, right? And that's a complement to, but not the same thing as the bystander effect. If we take the bystander effect to be a psychological phenomenon that's almost pre-rational or irrational, it's a function of our psychology, precognitive, maybe even. Yeah, like automatic, exactly. Yeah. Then what's happening is you've got a coupling effect where you might have the bystander effect, and I want to problematize that in a second, but you might have the bystander effect, but then you also might choose not to do something because you're weighing the consequences, and you might think, like Jennifer said, you know, you might be seen as a snitch or whatever, and there might be negative implications for you. You might be seeing yourself as harming somebody's career and whatever. So part of that is there's like a rational side, and that's the sort of stuff that Jennifer, I think you and I and Steve and many people here, and Camille, you too in the IRB, like we're trying to train people's rational side to understand like the nature of science and research and inquiry and academic success and like, you know, all those things to make them see that the thing they think is a negative implication when put in a bigger context is actually maybe for somebody's benefit. But that's the rational side, right? There's also the like bystander effect, pre-rational side. But then the other thing that I think Jennifer and Camille were talking about is at the intersection there is the question of like gender and race coupled to these problems. Because, you know, if two students, both under circumstances where they're trying to decide whether they should blow the whistle or not, you know, if one sees themselves at more at risk because of the nature of power dynamics and relations and everything else, like hypothetically a white male student of privilege is going to be maybe more likely to blow the whistle because the implications won't seem so negative, perhaps. All of that is sort of speculation. The last thing I wanted to say about the connection between the two things is that, Camille, you told the fish story, and Jennifer, you told the cheating student story. The cheating student story was about a morally wrong action that was also against the rules. The fish story was about a morally right action that was against the rules. And that's a really key difference. And that's something I know Steve Kubler, you and I talked a lot about the relationship between ethics and the rules. We like to think we live in institutions like UCF, where the rules in place are right rules, like ethically correct rules. But the fish story is a great example where, and I mean, it's arbitrary because it was sort of designed this way, but don't touch the fish, you're going to get expelled. But the right thing to do is to save the fish's life at the expense of your getting expelled. And these are, to me, those are the most interesting cases because, you know, it's hard enough to get people to follow the rules. And I know, Jennifer, that's your world for sure. But the other thing is like, how do we evaluate, how do we get students to a point or one another to a point where we can evaluate the ethicality of the rule? Not every rule we should follow all the time. There are certainly circumstances where, and Jennifer, close your ears, there may be circumstances in which cheating is the right thing to do. Now we could, those might be hard to parse out, but like all else being equal, cheating is wrong, right? But that doesn't mean that cheating is always wrong. And that's that weighing of the rules and the ethics that's so complicated. Steve Kubler, I gotta be quiet here. Yeah.
I think there's a second level to this, or maybe a nuance. As you set it up, there's you know, the challenge of intervening when there could be personal loss, and there's choosing to break a rule and do what is against the rule but is the ethical thing. But a second level to that is what I would say is, in contemporary times, an increasing tendency to take upon oneself the supposed right to be able to break rules because an individual self-interprets that it's the right thing to do, without necessarily having done any kind of thoughtful contemplation of the underlying ethics. So it's as though they're motivated by an ethical argument to break a rule without really understanding that there is perhaps an ethics behind the rule that is not known to them. And, you know, it can be reductio ad absurdum kind of, or trolley problem kind of arguments like, do you run the stop sign in the middle of the night just because you can't see cars coming? Well, you know, maybe you don't know that there's a blind spot, so maybe you're not really empowered to make that kind of decision. But I think it also cuts across much more fundamental issues like, you know, do I need to pay taxes? You know, the taxes are just too high, so I don't need to pay taxes. Okay, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Maybe you derive a lot more benefit from taxes than you realize. Who are you to unilaterally decide what rules to follow and so on? So I throw that out as a another thread to follow if we unpack the first level.
You know, you made me think of an example of a student that I was blown away by in his truest self and his authenticity of the decision that he made.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, he lost an uncle, and his aunt needed him to assist with some family situations that had happened, and it was an unexpected loss. And the student had an exam, and he was saying, I've got to pass this exam because this is my second time taking the class. I can't afford to get an F again. So he went ahead and asked a friend who is a non-UCF student to go take the test for him. And he said to me, he goes, I didn't send anybody in there that had any background knowledge of this coursework. I just needed to try to get as many points as I could, so I could at least get something as opposed to a 0. Mm-hmm. And the conviction that he had in that, not malicious, not cocky, not arrogant, not trying to get away with it. He looked at me and he had tears in his eye. He goes, what other option did I have? I have to save this. I can't afford this. I can't have all of these other things happen. And the justification of going, okay, Miss Wright, I didn't send somebody in who was a genius in finance. This kid never took a course before in his life. I was just hoping he could get me 5 points as opposed to 0. I wasn't looking for him to get 100. And it blew me away. And I really had to sit back and go, how do I unpack this? Because I've never heard this before. With such, again, true sense of, I know it wasn't the greatest thing I could have done, but I can actually live with this because of the options and things that I thought I was up against. It's one I'll never forget. I'll never forget that.
That's a really powerful story. I was thinking, it made me think, I do a workshop on integrity for the Pathways students, for our graduate students.
Yes.
And one of the things that we talk about in that is a case that Health and Human Services Office of Research Integrity has put out about research. And they make this little vignette about a postdoc student who faces the same sort of tensions, Jennifer, in the context of research, right? His PI is like, I need this data for this grant, get it now. But he's like, his partner is pregnant, he's missing doctor's appointments. Just like your student, he's torn between his personal integrity and his research integrity, his academic integrity, and he has to make a choice. And that's what ethics is about. It's those points like, what do we do in the conditions of value constraints, value conflicts? And it's hard because our institutions say, if you're wearing the academic integrity hat, if you're a student, you must follow the rules, right? But no student just wears that hat, and it's a point of privilege when you can, right? If you can take off all your other hats and just put that one on, then there's no reason you shouldn't follow the rules, and you're a better student for it. But almost nobody wears just one hat at a time. And it's those points of tension that I think are really important. So whether it's your student or whether it's this hypothetical researcher, That's got me so engaged about ethics, I think. Steve, go ahead.
It just strikes me that, as with the story that you just related of the student that's got to help the pregnant partner or help fulfill the job requirement or whatever, it seems to be artificially positioned into a dichotomy of either or, only two choices and no other options. And I think that's where so many ethical missteps actually occur, simply because either the circumstances or the individual who makes the misstep, is put in a place, or puts themselves in a place where they only see two options. And that's where there can be, when you do I guess a post-disaster analysis on a problem and you look back at what went wrong, I think those are instances where we often apportion blame, and rightly so, saying, it's the circumstance of the society or the leaders of the organization that didn't help to create third options. And I think we've kind of seen this, institutions across the country, and I think UCF does this well, addressing the ethics issue, making sure we have the pathways program for the students. So they have some training, which makes it, yes, maybe it's a little bit, covering yourself makes it hard to for students to say they just didn't know. But it's also about giving students exposure to case studies that maybe empower them to think about a third option, so that they don't feel like they're forced into this false dichotomy. And I think these kinds of conversations and reflections are important. I don't know how it happens when you're in the stress of a situation. Do you help the person bleeding on the sidewalk or just walk away? Stress often changes our ability to think rationally. But when we talk about the bystander effect, would it help if people connected to one another and say, gosh, what do we do? I'm not a professional. I'm afraid. What do you think? Well, I can call 911. Well, maybe I know some first aid. Maybe I can help. Maybe if, instead of just thinking about themselves versus the person, if they thought about themselves and the society and the others who may also be stuck with bystanderism, maybe that could defuse some tensions. So it gets to a question of, do we really have sense of community in our communities? Is that where the bystander effect originates? And are we encouraging people to embrace and think through a third option?
I was gonna say that's interesting about the third option, because I do think some people either don't have that option, or that's part of where they're working, or the options that they're given. That's it. And then with the podcast, when he mentioned that at that time he just didn't see it as a problem, wondering if part of it's like you said, like either finding a way to educate people at a young age, if they're not getting that from like their upbringing and growing up, having like ethics and these kind of questions about like moral decision making, or like if this happens, like it's bystander effect, if this happens, like what can you do, and having it implemented earlier on so that you do know to do these things and these different scenarios instead of avoiding it. Because I know from my upbringing, part of my family, like from my father's side, it was really, that was like what you must do, like no matter what. Whereas on my mom, it was like, you're a lady, maybe in some circumstances, yes, but if it's this kind of person, no. Or if this person's bigger, no. Or, so it's interesting, like having to weigh both of those and having like more exposure to situations like this and what you should be doing.
Yeah.
Camille, I'm sure you remember the sort of ethics literacy model that I find myself drawing on. That first step, like developing ethics sensitivity. How do we recognize an ethical issue when it arises? We spend, especially in philosophy, we spend a lot of time on the middle step, like ethical reasoning. Like once you've seen an ethical issue, how do you reason what the right and wrong thing to do is, at the expense of thinking about how do we recognize them in the first place. So I think it sounds like your upbringing gave you the position to see the distinctions that might be made and start to think about those issues from multiple perspectives. And I would say that's pretty rare. I mean, I think a lot of people, we get one perspective growing up, or we're not asked to ask those questions at all. And then then we end up in a philosophy class or in somebody's office like Jennifer and say like, why did you do this? What's the right and wrong thing to do? And you're like, well, I had no tools with which to evaluate that, right? It's just, yeah, I act from habit, on Stephen Hall's point, yeah.
And I don't know if, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I was gonna say, I know this may be like a little unrelated, but I think of it as just being in a position where there is going to be change in upper management and having maybe different cultures. I think at the university a while back, there was different culture on maybe how things are handled and how ethics is weighed in certain aspects. And so I think about, concerns whenever there is change in management of that, like, will the same importance be put on ethical decision making? What's morally correct? Like, how do you ensure that when you're doing a search for a new person in that position, how do you make sure that they also have that in mind, or how you continue that, fostering that? So, because it does trickle down, like working a couple, since 2013 in the position, what was held as correct or what needed to be done. It's very different than, now, and feeling that power to make the right choice regardless. So yeah, it's just interesting how much that can affect also, that decision.
There actually are some ethically gray areas. Steve mentioned about a binary choice, either do it or not do it. But I think there are some ethically gray areas. Like, so if the person comes to you and you're the only one that can help them, you have the knowledge, whatever, then you're really on the spot. But if there are others, then, ethically you might say, well, I can't help you. I just can't do that. But so-and-so can. There's another group of people that also could help you. Why don't you go to them? That's not, purely ethical for sure. So what do you do in a case like that? And in a way, it has to do with something that is brought up in the article that I posted there, the diffusion effect. And this happened in New York, where all these people are looking out the windows. They see this horrible incident that's going on in 1964, and they all think, well, gosh, this is happening in public where everybody can see it. Somebody will do something. And one person I know just said, well, he was tired. He went back to bed. They all thought someone else would do it. However, if you're on the beach and no lifeguards and someone is out there drowning and you're a good swimmer, there is nobody else. You are the one that is ethically bound to do something to try to help that person, even if it's swimming out with, a flotation device or some way to try to help them. It's all on you. The diffusion effect, though, I think is something that has to be considered in these ethical choices.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Stephen. It makes me wonder, like, how it seems like, what would the world be like if everybody had internalized the idea that they were ethically bound to act, right? You would have had, whatever it was, 40 people calling 911 for Kitty Genovese, maybe overloading the system. Maybe there's negative implications we can think about, but that's a very different world. And it's a very different effect than the bystander effect, which I think you summarized nicely, the idea that, I don't think I have to act because I know somebody else is going to act around me. And then everybody thinks that, and therefore no one acts. But if everybody acted, it would be a mess, I suppose. But it'd be a very different environment. Yeah. The bystander effect is really interesting. There was some undergraduate researchers actually at Purdue University, and their faculty mentor published this little article sort of as a critique of the bystander effect a few years back, pointing out that Kitty Genovese was a lesbian. In 1964 in New York City, homosexuality was not only illegal, but seen as immoral. And Kitty Genovese was known in her apartment complex, in her housing neighborhood. And so they proposed, like, without evidence, there's not any evidence of this, but they wondered if we've been reading too much into the psychology of the bystander effect, which was all driven by this one story of Genovese. If people had, instead of a psychological pre-rational choice not to act, maybe they chose not to act. And maybe that combination weakens the bystander effect a little bit. And that's a really interesting twist. And again, sort of a hypothesis, I guess. But if I like the idea that we don't have to give up our reasoned decision-making to psychological phenomena. Right? There's a pretty big push in ethics and moral psychology right now, especially to push back against the rationalizing end of ethics and to say a lot of our decisions, and for the moral psychologists, I think they'd argue most of our decisions are made pre-rationally. they're made, Stephen, to your point, from habit or from experience or training, right, which is habit, and that we don't actually rationalize very many of our decisions at all. And to think that sort of, again, sort of gives up on the need to rationalize. So there's got to be some balance, and that's what's got me so interested about the bystander effect, because I think it is that balancing. There might be some limitations, we might make some assumptions, but if we're habituated to act, that's got to counteract those assumptions in some case, right? If there's 50 people on your beach, Stephen, and one person drowning, but 20 of those people have learned that they should act when they can, and they all go swimming, that person's probably going to get rescued. Or a few more people are going to drown, depending on how that goes. But you get the idea.
Yeah, that's true. The other thing I think to consider that may get in the way, there are scam artists that can take advantage of a person's sympathetic feelings. That happens all the time. We get emails asking for money. We have people standing on street corners with their hand out, looking for a donation. I've got a short story that I'll tell you, and I wish I could remember all the details, but a very close friend of mine saw a seemingly upset person outside a grocery store where he was shopping. And he, instead of just walking in, he inquired, what the problem was. And the woman said that she and her partner had just come into town. They had a backpack that had been stolen, so they had no money. Apparently, they had consulted with a police officer, from what this person told me. And I know him to be totally honest, so it seems rather strange to me. But at any rate, the police officer said I couldn't help. And so this person said, well, let me see if I can help you out. In the end, he actually ended up taking the individual and her partner in his car to an inexpensive hotel, paid for their first few nights, actually, or the first night. I think it was $80 is what he paid. He begged me not to tell his wife did not know about what he had done. He said, please don't tell my wife. And who knows, it didn't seem to be a scam, but it could have been. I mean, he didn't give them any money directly. And of course, the same thing, I guess, with a person who's on the street corner wanting money, and maybe they're just going to buy another bottle of whiskey with it instead. So, yeah, you do need to use a reasoned approach, I think, in consideration of these ethical, moral choices that you have to make.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I don't think I thought much about the role of sympathy or empathy in those sorts of decision making. But yeah, I can imagine, I'm sure it's the case, that if we're uncritically sympathetic, that we're easily taken advantage of, right? And that's true probably of the citizen, and also true of the faculty member and the student at the university.
Well, let me tell you one more story that you probably have heard about that's recent. Speaking of faculty members, I guess you probably read in the Orlando Sentinel the story of Jacqueline Bingston, who enrolled at Rollins College at 18, and her study of passion was in Buddhist philosophy and so on. She studied with a very popular professor, Mario D'Amato. This is all in the Orlando Sentinel, so I'm not giving anything away. And even though this guy was very popular, he was very crude. And students did love him, but in the end, this innocent 18-year-old, really, this guy had a great knowledge, and she was very attracted to his knowledge. But in the end, he was kind of attracted to her sexually. And she just recently gave a speech, essentially, to the public, because this happens so often involving young female students and sometimes academicians, professors, who take advantage of their role. But she resisted for a while because of social pressure. I mean, other students really liked this professor. They thought he was great, he was funny, so on and so forth. But in the end, she was a bit of a target, maybe an innocent, naive target of his passions. And I'm sure that happens, often. And yet she didn't want to be chastised by the other students who maybe didn't have the same issues to deal with. So that's just another ethical issue. What do you do when the social pressures say, just deal with it on your own. Don't tell anybody.
Those are really complicated issues, because in that story, in stories like those, of which there were many, fewer and fewer, I think, thankfully, but there's that social pressure combined with the power dynamic, right? The UCF has developed really strong rules against those kind of relationships, not because of moral reasons, really, but because of power reasons, right? That typically, the student is at a disadvantage to the much older, more experienced, and more powerful faculty member. Right. So those kind of relationships, even among, in the research context, even among members of a research team, if there's any kind of power hierarchy, there's really strict rules about how that's governed and what that looks like, for very good reasons. I think a lot of institutions have that. But I remember, I haven't been doing this all that long, but I remember very distinctly as an undergraduate, I could name four or five professors who had married at least one student across their career, right? And this is like, 50 to 20, that sort of difference in age range. And that was kind of the norm, or at least it happened a lot, right? It was kind of, and it was looked down on, but there weren't any rules in place around it. And I think a lot of universities like UCF have said, kind of come around to the idea that because of the power imbalance, that's, we're cutting that off. That's a terminable offense at this point.
Yeah. Well, and what you do on the outside also has an effect. That we lost actually a very good life at UCF professor, who was fired because of something he had done on the outside. It was criminal what he had done. And I liked him a lot, as far as he gave great talks. It's kind of sorry to see him go. So that's another area, professional conduct on the outside as well.
Yeah, I think those issues of social pressures, that's what feeds into the bystander effect. And Camille, you asked a really interesting question in the chat about whether that sort of those social pressures change in individualistic cultures or in collective cultures. I'm assuming, Camille, you're taking the US to be more or less an individualistic culture. There are little bits of
I think there's pockets. I don't think that there's not like solely one, especially in the US, because you have it so diverse. But I do wonder, I think Steve had mentioned about like having that sense of community and asking others. And I just think in countries where there is more of a sense of community and you have a closer, that person is not just a random person that's walking by. This is someone you may have seen more than once. Having that sense of community and interaction, whether that bystander effect is like lessened in some way, because you're like, oh, this isn't just, John Smith on the corner. This is, this random person. I'm just wondering, not that you have to know the person so personally, but having that sense of community, feeling like you're one of a group and this is not just a random person, this is part of your community. So, intervening because of that. I also, just jumping back to that podcast, something that I found interesting that they had mentioned was when he was describing not being picked up or him not realizing it. And then when she said, well, now that you've gone through this and you're not this person anymore, you must feel some sense of relief. And he was just like, no, not at all. And so I thought that was interesting, because part of me wanted to be like, no, feel like you've changed. Like part of growing is like, being able to acknowledge like we all have faults and like learning from that and being able to, know. And I think in his stance is like, I don't want to say that I think like it was like this weird balance of like trying not to not trying to forgive himself, or maybe not, still standing on the fact that was incorrect and stating like, I know that this was incorrect, and not like giving himself a pass. But I think that sometimes I was just trying to think of like being able to forgive yourself, and doesn't necessarily mean you're not saying that this thing that you did was correct. So it was just an interesting thing that he ended with, that I was like, I don't know. It was like a weird feeling for me. I was like, I feel bad for him, but then at the same time, the action that happened, I was like, no, I totally disagree in this situation, what happened. But yeah, it was just an interesting thing.
Does make me
Well,
wonder what
that brings in the time factor. In other words, he needed to make a decision. This person taking a test, and yet afterward, when he had more time to think about it, he's thinking, well, if I had more time to think about that decision, I wouldn't have done it. And now I know I would not do it again. Yeah, I think that's acceptable.
Dr. Kubley?
Just as Camille was talking and circling back to community, it kind of struck me that the whole framing of the topic as a bystander effect reinforces the dichotomy. It's the person who needs help and the individual who chose not to help. But if you believe in the social impacts, then it makes me question why we treat it as a two-body problem and not a multi-body problem. You know, I don't mean to dismiss the culpability of the bystander who chooses not to help, but rather to recognize how important the social connection is, and how even just discussing the problem in that kind of two-body framework really undermines or does not sufficiently recognize the importance of how society will shape people to decide or not to act, especially under pressure in a harrowing situation.
Just to add on before turning it over to Jennifer, there's some of the research that came out of the psychology of the bystander effects evidences the difference between just yelling help when you're in need and yelling, hey, guy in the maroon shirt with the blue collar, help. I mean, that difference, even though it's not relational, and Camille's point, like you don't know the person's name, you don't have a relationship to them, but drawing attention to the individual seems to change the nature of the bystander effect. Camille, yeah, and making eye contact, like making it more personal, even if it's not, just making the effect seem personal changes the nature of our, I guess, sense of responsibility. And that's where like I'm still a little gray. Jennifer, go ahead.
Camille, I so appreciate you bringing up the whole thing about forgiveness. That is the number one topic that I deal with in the sessions with students if I may say, after the incident occurs. And I do these action plans with students, and I am constantly asking them, have you felt the need to forgive yourself for this? If not, okay. If so, have you? And if you haven't, what's causing you not to be able to? So forgiveness is a very big thing, because a lot of the work, and especially with academic misconduct, it is riddled in shame. And so how do I take that shame that I chose this decision, if I may say, of sound mind and body, as I kind of say to my contemporaries who do rules of conduct, I have never had a student say, well, I cheated because I was high, or I cheated because I was drunk, or I cheated because I had some kind of other influence. You know, this was truly my decision that I made. Nobody was forcing me to do this or anything like that. So it is riddled in shame. And so there is a lot of the forgiveness work that I do. And I mean, all I have to do is actually ask a student when I'm feeling it, have you forgiven yourself for this? And here come the tears. And they're like, no, I haven't. But I have actually had some students say what that person said is, if I do that, then am I justifying what I did was okay? And I was like, no, you're not. You're still accepting what has happened, but what are you going to do now? And to get to the doing now part, you have to forgive yourself, or you're just going to stay in that kind of an area. So it's been fascinating to see all these things. I mean, when I first started and I had my first student, I thought I knew it. I was like, oh, it's a time management issue, or, you know, they thought they could get away with it. They thought, oh my God, there are so many layers to this that I had no idea about, like that. So really before we end or anything, I don't know if anybody here has a great book recommendation that they would have or anything like that. I am totally into reading all things about these areas now. I've been a voracious nonfiction reader for the last 2 years. And I'm always looking for other things. So if anybody has any suggestions or thoughts, I would appreciate that.
There's been a lot of really interesting philosophical work done on forgiveness. I'm blanking on the author right now. It's somewhere on my shelf. I'll look at that and send it your way. But forgiveness is really interesting just as a philosophical concept because it's torn. I think you and Camille have described the tension torn between the sort of absolution end of forgiveness, the sort of letting go, and the internalizing the conditions sense of forgiveness. And you want your students, Jennifer, I think, to do the latter, not the former, right? But I think many of us and many of our students come from cultural and maybe religious backgrounds where we've been attuned to the absolution forgiveness. And that's why students don't, I think, again, I'm hypothesizing, but that may be one reason why students don't want to let go. They don't want to forgive because they think, yeah, I don't want to call it out, Camille, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Catholic guilt, Catholic shame.
No, I was gonna say, I was like, I grew up the Catholic, so I feel like there was a lot of time trying to learn that kind of stuff through therapy. And it's interesting because it's a lot of it came back to like, well, if I forgive myself, then I'm saying it's okay. Or there's that fear that by forgiving yourself, you may do the same thing again, and tying it together. So it's just an interesting, yeah.
Yep. And I don't want to blame the Catholics with a big C. It could be any sort of denomination of the monotheistic bent. But I think, and right, that sounds disparaging of religion. I don't mean to do that. Instead, I think what's happening is I think our cultural and religious and societal upbringings make us think of forgiveness as that sort of absolution. But I think that sort of internalizing the change and recognizing the conditions under which X happened can lead to the new self. And it is interesting that, like, even though on Thomas, the guy from the podcast, Thomas recognized he changed over time, to Camille's point, like to Camille's point, the change, even though he saw himself as changed, he didn't want to let go of that previous self because the previous self is what led to the new self, right? It's that sort of continuation of the self over time. Anyway, the bystander effect is fascinating. This has been a really fun discussion, and we could do this for a lot longer, but I want to respect everybody's time. We have one more of these scheduled on April 27th. If anybody's interested in talking about research or thinking they've done about ethics in their own work, that's the session to do it. I may invite I met a graduate student at the Graduate Research Week who's doing some really interesting work on identity construction for artificial intelligence. And she's really interested in how to do that justly, because there's all kinds of questions about how we interpret the race and gender and cultural background of AI voices. There's all kinds of justice issues embedded in there. So I might invite her to speak about her research as part of that. But if anyone else is interested, that'll be our last session. We'll take a brief pause over the summer and we'll be back to do Be Better Club again in the fall. So if anybody has suggestions for topics, I'd love to hear them. Thank you all for being here. And Shanor, thank you. We didn't hear from you, but I'm so grateful you're here again. Jennifer, thanks for joining us. And Stephen and Camille, we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Everybody.
Bye
So
all.
long.